An aging king, three ambitious daughters, and a love trial trigger a tragedy. King Lear is a story of betrayal, madness, and redemption in the turbulent age of English mythology. In the ancient kingdoms of medieval Britain, old King Lear had ruled for long years with a firm hand. However, feeling the weight of age on his shoulders, he decided that the time had come to cede the throne to the next generation. Lear had three daughters: Goneril, the eldest, an ambitious and cold woman; Regan, the middle, bitter and envious; and Cordelia, the youngest, a maiden of noble soul and pure heart. Gathering his court in the great hall of the castle, the king announced his decision to abdicate and divide his vast kingdom among his three heiresses. But before doing so, he wished to test his daughters' love for him. One by one, he asked them to declare publicly the depth of their filial affection. Whoever expressed their love most eloquently would receive the largest portion of the kingdom. Goneril was the first to speak, flattering her father with honeyed words. Regan was not far behind, uttering even more exaggerated flattery. Satisfied with the flowery declarations of his eldest daughters, Lear turned to the quiet Cordelia. But Cordelia, being of an honest and sincere nature, replied without embellishment, "Nothing, sire. I love your majesty according to my duty, no more and no less." Her frank and direct answer infuriated the vain Lear, who interpreted her words as a lack of filial love. "Then you shall receive nothing. The lordships, riches, and favors I thought to bestow upon you are nullified," he vociferated, cruelly disinheriting his most loyal daughter. The noble Earl of Kent, a veteran advisor to the crown, had dared to defy Lear's decision to disinherit the faithful Cordelia. In a fit of rage, the vain monarch sentenced the earl to banishment for daring to contradict him. Kent, despite his high rank, had no choice but to leave the kingdoms of Brittany on pain of death. After the solemn act of dividing his kingdom, the elder Lear departed the court accompanied by a small retinue of loyal knights and servants. He planned to alternate his residence between the castles of Goneril and Regan, his new rulers. However, the true selfish nature of his eldest daughters would soon be exposed. In the first castle where she stayed, that of the haughty Goneril, problems soon arose. The new mistress of the fief considered it a grievance to have to maintain the large entourage that accompanied her father. With disdain, she insinuated that Lear should dismiss half of his knights and servants to save expenses. The old king, still blinded by affection for his firstborn, refused such an affront. Bitter words were exchanged and discord was sown between father and daughter. Finally, Lear decided to leave that castle and try his luck in the lands of Regan. But upon arrival, he was met with an equally hostile reception. The bitter Regan, envious of her sister's power, boasted that she would not tolerate the old man's demands and whims. A violent quarrel broke out, and the irate Lear cursed his two eldest daughters, vowing never to set foot in his domain again. In his anger, the unhappy monarch decided to go into exile with his faithful jester and a handful of servants who were still loyal to him. Lear was exposed to the inclement weather without shelter in the vast and desolate countryside. It was in those wastelands that the king's mind began to crack under the weight of filial betrayal and harsh privations. His sanity hung by a thread as beastly storms raged across the land. While the deranged Lear wandered through the desolate battlefields, bitterly lamenting the ingratitude of his daughters, another nobleman suffered an equally heinous betrayal in the shadows of the realm. The loyal Duke of Gloucester had fallen victim to a plot hatched by his bastard son, Edmund. Using forged documents and slander, Edmund convinced his father that his legitimate brother Edgar was hatching a plot to assassinate him and seize his inheritance. The disgusting lie struck a chord with the gullible Gloucester, who came to view his firstborn as an unworthy traitor. Edgar, alerted by a faithful servant, had no choice but to flee in disguise to save his life, becoming just another outlaw wandering the inhospitable wilderness. Thus, while Lear was stripped of his kingdom by the greed of Goneril and Regan, the loyal son Edgar was unjustly disinherited by the insidiousness of the bastard Edmund. Two more nobles fell victim to filial ingratitude in a tragedy that was only beginning to unfold. However, The loyal vassal Kent was not willing to leave his beloved sovereign in the hands of the greedy Goneril and Regan. He then devised a ruse to remain close to Lear and watch over his safety in disgrace. Disfiguring his face and dressing in rags, Kent adopted the identity of a humble servant named Caius. Under that disguise, he managed to join the small group of servants who accompanied the banished king on his erratic wanderings. No one, not even Lear, suspected that the ragged bully who responded rudely to his outbursts of madness was his faithful friend and counselor, Kent. The disguise proved perfect, allowing him to watch over the king without arousing suspicion. On more than one occasion, Caius' actions saved Lear from falling into the clutches of bandits or perishing exposed to inclement weather. With cunning, the false servant managed to lead the insane monarch away from the dangers that beset them. But it was not only from external threats that Kent had to protect the unstable Lear. In his worst crises of madness, the old king used to attempt against his own life, cursing his existence and longing for death as the only way out of his torments. The disinherited Cordelia, upon learning of the terrible fate that had befallen her beloved father, did not hesitate to seek allies willing to reverse the unjust situation. From the distant land of France, the noble maiden began to gather an army of brave men to restore the good name of King Lear and crush the overweening ambitions of Goneril and Regan. Though banished and stripped of everything, Cordelia would remain steadfast in her resolve to assert righteousness over wickedness. Loyal Kent, maintaining his disguise as a humble servant, would do his best to protect the king from himself and the dangers that lurked on the roads. The jester, on the other hand, never left the side of his maddened master. With his witticisms and witty repartee, he managed to momentarily appease Lear's anger, bringing him back to reality for brief moments. This humble comedian became the only link that kept the king tied to his already fragile sanity. Meanwhile, the ambitious Goneril and Regan consolidated their power over Lear's former territories. Boasting of their triumph, they lived a life of luxury and pleasure while their unhappy father suffered the worst miseries. But their apparent victory would be short-lived, for Cordelia was already on the march with a powerful army ready to restore her as the rightful heir. The imminent civil war threatened to unleash an unprecedented bloodbath in the British lands. While King Lear fell into wandering insanity and Cordelia gathered her forces to invade, Edmund, the bastard son of Gloucester, continued his devious plans of usurpation. Having convinced his father of the supposed treachery of his legitimate brother Edgar, he saw his way clear to seize the inheritance and titles that did not belong to him. But Edmund was not a man satisfied with small ambitions. With the cunning of a serpent, he had won the trust of the wicked Goneril and Regan, rising as one of the main commanders of their armies. Seduced by power, the bastard harbored dark designs to further aggrandize his position by taking advantage of the chaos of the impending civil war. In secret meetings with Goneril, Edmund began to hatch a plan to get rid of her husband, the noble Albany, one of the few lords still loyal to the dethroned Lear. With the Duke out of the way, the ambitions of Edmund and his lover, Goneril, could expand unopposed. For her part, Regan had also fallen prey to the charms of the handsome bastard. Envious of the love her sister aroused in Edmund, the bitter woman plotted to eliminate Goneril to have the burly commander all to herself. Thus, the quarrels between the evil sisters reached new and dangerous dimensions. Amid these dark palace conspiracies, Edgar, the disinherited legitimate son of Gloucester, continued his wandering disguised as a mad beggar. On more than one occasion, his footsteps crossed those of the small retinue accompanying the demented King Lear. A strange bond seemed to brew between Edgar and the deranged monarch in those chance encounters. Both were souls stripped of their rightful status and wealth by the ingratitude of traitorous sons. Misery had equalized them in utter indignity. The loyal jester who faithfully followed the mad king recognized in that ragged man the true identity of Edgar. He saw in him the opportunity to add one more ally to the cause of restoring Lear to his throne and unmasking Edmund's treachery to his father Gloucester. Deftly and discreetly, the jester built bridges of dialogue between the disguised prince and Earl Kent, who continued to watch over the king under his disguised identity as the servant Caius. Slowly, the threads of a restoration plot began to weave. However, the conspirators had to act with extreme caution, for the tentacles of the bastard Edmund extended into every corner of the kingdom. No nobleman or soldier could consider himself completely loyal as long as the vile traitor enjoyed the favor of Goneril and Regan. News of the advances of Cordelia and her French army set off the alarm bells. Edmund saw the perfect opportunity to eliminate any hint of resistance to his ambitions. He convinced the governesses to arrest all loyalists suspected of supporting the imminent landing of the rightful heiress. One by one, the nobles who still swore allegiance to the dethroned Lear began to be imprisoned or summarily executed. A bloodbath was spreading across the fields and castles of Brittany as Edmund strengthened his commanding position in the forces of Goneril and Regan. In the shadows, the seditious jesters, Kent and Edgar, continued to wait for the best opportunity to thwart the bastards' plans before it was too late. They knew that Cordelia's arrival would be the signal to initiate their restoration movement. Soon, French troops commanded by Cordelia landed on the British shores, ready to confront the military might of the usurper sisters, Goneril and Regan. The first great battle broke out when the enemy armies met on the plains of Dover. It was a brutal clash of steel and blood, where thousands of precious lives were mowed down in a few days of carnage. In the heat of the fray, Edmund proved to be a ruthless and relentless commander. His bold tactics succeeded in containing the initial thrust of the Frankish forces and dangerously weakening their lines. But the noble Cordelia would not relent. With her army reinforced by loyal Bretons determined to fight for good King Lear, she managed to momentarily reverse course through bold maneuvers. It was in one of these critical maneuvers that Edmund and Edgar, the two feuding brothers, found themselves face to face. A fierce single battle broke out between the two sons of Gloucester. For long minutes, neither succeeded in gaining a clear upper hand over his opponent. Finally, in a violent backlash, Edgar's sword struck Edmund in the side, opening a lethal wound. As he lay bleeding to death, the dying Edmund revealed all his devious machinations against Edgar to his father, Gloucester, purifying his soul before he expired. Gloucester, shocked to tears, fell to his knees, cursing his injustice against loyal Edgar. The weight of his error became unbearable in those dramatic moments. Edgar, fully restored, rushed to join Cordelia to continue the fight. Edmund's treachery had finally been exposed. Then the young princess led a last desperate attack against the enemy lines. The battle took on a tint of true carnage, with Britannic and Frankish blood staining the fields alike. In the rawest line of combat, Cordelia clashed swords with her sister, Goneril. Both, driven by fury and rancor, fought viciously, completely forgetting the blood ties that bound them together. Goneril, blind with rage, swung her steel with erratic and dangerous movements. In a violent backhand, her sword reached to tear Cordelia's cheek, leaving a bleeding gash. But the noble young woman did not retreat and responded with a rain of accurate blows. Finally, in a violent clash of their weapons, Goneril's sword flew away, leaving her defenseless in front of her sister. Cordelia then had the opportunity to put an end to his miserable life, but in a gesture of supreme clemency, she spared him in the name of the dethroned Lear. The battle continued with equal or greater intensity, but the forces of Goneril and Regan began to retreat before the overwhelming thrust of the French and their loyal Breton allies. After long hours of fierce fighting, the gates of the main castle finally fell. Cordelia and her troops stormed victoriously into the fortress, only to find a Dantesque scene. Regan, consumed by the sick jealousy that gnawed at her, had murdered her sister Goneril before taking her own life. The lifeless bodies of both women lay in a pool of blood in the throne room. But the most tragic awaited the noble Cordelia. In the dungeons of the castle, she found in chains the broken bodies of her beloved father, King Lear, and the faithful Kent. Both had been brutally tortured for refusing to reveal the plans for the French invasion. With tears of anguish, Cordelia freed her father and the loyal Earl from their bonds. But the damage inflicted on the old monarch was too great. In a last flash of lucidity, Lear was able to recognize his favorite daughter and murmur a few words of regret before exhaling his last breath. Cordelia collapsed over her father's corpse, consumed with grief and sorrow. Kent tried vainly to comfort her, but tragedy had done its devastating work. After long weeks of strife, betrayal, and death, peace finally returned to the broken lands of ancient Britain, but at too high a cost. Can the Kingdom of Britannia recover from war and pain? The future is uncertain, but the story of King Lear teaches us that ambition and vanity only lead to destruction. This video has been created for the Labyrinth of Crete. Thank you for staying until the end of this magnificent story. See you on the next adventure.